It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So, Tale of Two Cities, one of Dickens. It's not Dickens' most famous book. I would say that would have to be Christmas Carol, and that wasn't a book so much as a novella. It has one of the most opening sentences, and that thing I just read to you was one sentence, and it has one of the most memorable last sentences. You don't get that too often in books, actually. I'm trying to think. The only one I can think of that would be similar would be 1984 by George Orwell, or Ulysses by James Joyce, which has pretty famous, they have pretty famous endings, but also semi-famous beginnings. By the way, the end of Tale of Two Cities is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. If you have not read any Dickens novels, this is the one that I recommend you read. It's fairly short. It's historically based. Lots of action. This is the thing, though, is it's not really, what would I say, a typical Dickens novel. And I don't just mean in terms of length. I mean in terms of how many characters there are. So there's actually quite a, there's very few characters compared to most Dickens novels. Of course, most Dickens novels are 700-page monstrosities. So, okay. You do get a lot of the violence and melodrama and that kind of thing that you normally get in a Dickens novel. But the one thing you really don't get in a Dickens novel, which is kind of ironic, given it's the Tale of Two Cities, is you don't actually get a lot of London. The two cities are supposed to be London and Paris, but you actually don't get very much of actual London. It's all interior shots, as it were. Not much on the exterior. There's a courtroom scene at the beginning. There's some other stuff going on in London. There's how shall we put it, man of the night, stealing corpses to sell to medical students, basically. What did they call this? A resurrection man. Is what they were called. And it's a plot point because there's a character that's supposedly dead. The guy goes to find the corpse. It's not there. He thinks someone stole it before him. What happens is that it was a sham funeral. There was nobody who had died. And the guy had faked his death. And there are reasons for that. Those are very side characters. This is not a big spoiler. Okay. So it's not a typical Dickens novel. You actually don't get much of London, which is what Dickens actually knows really well. So Bleak House is, if you really, really want to know the best of Dickens, I would recommend Bleak House. But it is your standard, very long novel. You get a lot of London and flavors of London in Bleak House that you don't get in Tale of Two Cities. But I do want to talk about two characters specifically. They're not main characters. One is not so well known, one is very well known, and that's Miss Pross and Madame Defarge. Everybody knows Madame Defarge knitting, and the whole point about her knitting is she is knitting in code, that she is encoding the people they're gonna get, because this starts out well before the French Revolution. It starts years before, and they're getting ready. There is also the French Revolution, but where it ends is basically the Reign of Terror, which is, I believe, around 1792. So remember, the fall of the Bastille is in 1789, and then you get the Year of Terror is, I believe, 1792, and Napoleon comes after that. So the point is, like, all of the guillotining didn't start at the very beginning. It got into a frenzy, as I said, in the Year of Terror, the Reign of Terror. So Madame Defarge is one of the women who is feeding this, and they are putting everybody down. And the point here is, it's not so much that she wants vengeance against particular people who did particular wrongs. And some of the stories they tell, you're like, oh, well, yeah, I can kind of see why you want vengeance for that. The issue is guilt by association. Anybody who ever helped that person, or even just related to that person, that's one of our main characters, whose name I totally forget because he's essentially a non-entity. Doesn't matter. He was some French aristocrat, which he totally disavows, leaves for England, and becomes basically a French teacher, and he's an aristo in exile. He comes back to France only to save this faithful servant who is being persecuted in France because he had helped aristos, just being a friend. He didn't have to do anything bad against anybody else. And Dickens captures very well. He captured this very well in Barnaby Rudge about rioting and just the persecution of innocents and how mobs behave. But because that was a little too close to home in England, having the mob be so active in France instead kind of displaces that. You don't really see that the English society is that much better than the French, other than the French are so much worse in terms of how the aristocrats treat the peasantry, I guess I will call it. But there was also so much want and so hungry. That said, the terror was driven more by middle class type people, lawyers, and people who held some grudges, and a lot of them got led to the guillotine as well. So Madame Defarge is doing this, but she gets taken out by Miss Pross. Miss Pross is, how shall I say, the companion of Lucy Manette, who marries the other guy, and I forget their name, because again, I just don't care. I have to look it up. Darnay, Charles Darnay. Okay, so she'll be Lucy Darnay. She marries him. That's not much of a spoiler either. But they're trying to escape France. There's a whole thing. And what's interesting about what Dickens does with this, and he often does this with social issues, is that he personalizes it. So the Darnays are trying to escape France, and Madame Defarge, she doesn't care that neither Mr. or Monsieur or Madame Darnay, none of them did anything wrong. It was just Charles Darnay's father and I believe uncle that actually did anybody ever wrong. Neither of the Darnays. So she must have her vengeance. Well, Miss Pross is kind of left behind to pretend that Lucy is in her room, fainted away or whatever, and she is going to prevent Madame Defarge from getting in that room and knowing that they are gone. And once Madame Defarge realizes this, she's going to rush out and try to call the alarm to have people go after them. And she has like a pistol in her belt and on her dress and knives and whatever. And they struggle. The gun goes off. It kills Madame Defarge, and Miss Pross is permanently deafened because of this shot. Miss Pross is 100% badass, and she is protective of Lucy, has grown up with her and protected her all those years. So it's an interesting contrast in two women, probably about the same age, I guess. One married, one not, but one who is bloodthirsty and wants vengeance. Okay, so the true hero of the novel, other than Miss Pross, but she's only deafened as opposed to have her head sliced off, is Sidney Carton, who is in love with Lucy, but obviously he doesn't marry her because she prefers Charles Darnay. And yeah, there's the "'tis a far, far better" thing. He goes to the guillotine in place of Charles Darnay. Yeah, spoiler alert. But again, with Dickens, it doesn't matter if you know the twists ahead of time because that's not the value of Dickens. And it's part of it is also he sets it up very blatantly early on. Uh, that some if he throws in something that like two people look so much alike that it helps win a court case, which is how the book begins, you better believe that it's going to come up as a major plot point by the end. So that's not what makes me end the book crying. And I do end the book crying. It's the woman who is in the cart, the tumbrel with him, on the way to the guillotine. She, again, like most of the people who are going to the guillotine, have done nothing wrong. I don't even remember, it was like her sister did something. Again, guilt by association, and she doesn't even know why. And she's a true believer in the French Revolution. And that happened to a lot of just normal, ordinary people in the French Revolution. And the lesson, I would say, for Tale of Two Cities that is coming there, it's not merely that vengeance, but just vengeance unleashed, where you try to go after not only whoever did you a direct wrong, but anyone who's a friend of that person who did you a direct wrong. And even they didn't have to be a friend of the person, just related to them in some way. And that's what happened to a lot of the people. And it was also very arbitrary. Some people got out and some people didn't. With regards to Madame Defarge, it was very personal. In some of the cases, it was political, whatever. It was just a big old meat grinder. And that this woman, she goes to the guillotine with Sidney. They're holding hands. They say a prayer together. And part of the story, of course, is also it's kind of a Christian conversion of Sidney Carton. But when it comes to Christianity, Dickens tends to be very surface, in my opinion. But he's very pro-Christian, obviously, but he tends not to be too blatant about it, and he definitely doesn't take any particular sides. He shows Catholics and Protestants and all sorts of religious people in a good light. He doesn't take a negative view. In any case, if you've never read Dickens, actually read A Christmas Carol. That's really short. But if you want to read one of his novels and say you read one of his novels, then go with A Tale of Two Cities or Great Expectations, which is one of the novels I didn't read last year because that's one a lot of us are forced to read in school already. That's the other one. They're both about the same length in terms of they're very short. And it's beginner Dickens, I would say. Very enjoyable. I actually haven't watched any movie or miniseries, so there seems to be two of them from 1980. I don't know why there was a wave for Tale of Two Cities in 1980. Go figure. So one seems to be a BBC miniseries, multiple episodes. It's on Amazon Prime. I added it to my watch list. And then there seems to be a 2.5-hour movie from 1980 for Tale of Two Cities. So I'll watch those both. But it's a quick book. Get an audiobook version, read the text, enjoy. See you later.